So, after the success of my video on how to house your leopard geckos, where I went through step by step and all the items that you need, how to set up a leopard gecko in a manner that will be both cost effective and have something that looks kind of nice, I got a lot of views on that video and it did really well. So I figured today I would do the same video for another gecko, actually probably the second most popular gecko that's out there in the pet trade, and that is the Crested gecko. So in my hands here's an adult female crested gecko. She's probably a little bit bigger than the average sized crested gecko, so they don't always become as beefy as this one is right here, but this is basically the animal we're going to look to house today. So now usually when you're going to buy a crested gecko, and this video is for the novices, this is for people that just want the gecko as a pet, they don't really have any plans on breeding the animal. This is just how to set up a nice cage, basically just to help you guys out when you're going to the pet store and you're picking out your equipment for your animal. So this is an adult. They sometimes get a little bit bigger than this. Like I said, she's a little bit above average in terms of size of crested geckos. They often will stay a little bit smaller than this, especially males. They'll actually be a lot thinner than this. So this is an adult. Typically you're not going to buy your animal when it is an adult unless you plan on breeding them. Typically you're going to buy them when they're juvenile size. Now I'm going to actually show you guys how big the hatchlings are. So this is pretty much the size they hatch out as. So you guys could see they're quite small, right? Now ideally you don't want to buy them when they're this big. Honestly, usually if they're this size they're not more than a month old, and if you're a novice you should go with an animal that's between 3 and 6 months of age. Also the advantage to that is you'll actually know the sex of the animal. Usually you could either sex using a jeweler's loupe to see the pores in between the legs when they're smaller, and then once they're 6 months it should be pretty obvious. The male has a quite large hemipenal bulge and the females do not. So I actually don't have a juvenile here to show you, but the animal that we would be housing would be a juvenile, because these hatchlings, they need to be kept on paper towel to avoid any impaction risk, because as you will see we're going to be using plantation soil here, and plantation soil, while it is very rare that the babies will actually become impacted, and impaction is when they eat the substrate and it causes an intestinal blockage that sometimes ends up killing the animal, unfortunately. It very rarely happens with this stuff here, but again, unless they're older than 3 months and they're about this long including the tail, we do not want to put them on this. We'll keep them on paper towel. But for the purposes of this video, this is assuming you're buying a juvenile at a pet store, or a juvenile from a breeder, but even the geckos you'll find in pet stores, they're all captive bred at this point anyways. So let's go over the equipment. First off, we'll start with the cage. Now in this instance we're going with a 18 inches tall by 12 inches by 12 inches exo-terra terrarium. The terrarium is not really too important. We're going with a glass terrarium in this case because, like I said, this is for people who are looking to have a I don't want to say a naturalistic vivarium, because we're going to use fake plants in this, but just a nice setup, because these are animals that could be housed in plastic containers quite easily, just because they need room temperature or just a little bit above room temperature depending on where you live. So for this video we're actually going to use this size cage. Now an adult may be better suited to live in one of these, which is the 18 by 18 by 18 cage. The reason why we're not going to use one in this video is because you guys can see they actually have nozzles attached to each of them, so I can't exactly pull the cages out. But even though we're going with this smaller one, I actually do recommend the smaller one for juveniles and for babies, just because crested geckos are not very good hunters when it comes to chasing down their crickets. And if you put a little baby in a giant terrarium like this, not only will it be hard for the baby to find the crickets, but it'll expend a lot of energy hunting them, as opposed to like what it'll actually get by eating crickets. So you're better off going in with a smaller terrarium like this for when they're babies, and then move up to that size when they're about a year old, if possible. If not, you could actually house the gecko its whole life in this. Sometimes what ends up happening though, if you house an adult in this its whole life, they tend to end up with something called floppy tail syndrome a lot more. Basically, they don't have optimal amount of space to move around in these cages, and sometimes the tail dip over, it seems. I find that the geckos that are housed in the bigger terrariums, they don't encounter this, I don't want to even say like, it's not even an illness, it's just something that happens, honestly. Like, it doesn't affect the gecko too much at all. The balance won't be off or anything like that. But anyways, that's probably for another video to talk about that. So let's move on. We have our cage. Our substrate in this case will be plantation soil. This is a Hagen product, but you could also use Beta Beast and Eco Earth, I believe, are some of the other brands out there. Both from Zoomed, and don't exactly know who Beta Beast is from, but either way. And then from there, we're going to take a look at the decorations we're going to put in our terrarium. Crested geckos and arboreal geckos in general really love these cork hides. We're actually going to stand this up. They love hiding in these things. If you're going to go with a hide for your gecko, definitely go with a piece of cork bark. Very light, very easy to clean. And then we have a hanging plant with a suction cup. I'm just going to make a very basic cage. We're basically only going to have these two things in. Obviously, you could put more vines if you'd like, and more plants. Now, when it comes to feeding these animals, we're lucky in this instance because we have Repashy. Basically, this is a meal replacement, and about 75% of their diet could consist of just this. Now, they've been releasing different formulas of this stuff, and from what I've heard is that it's lacking a bit in calcium, and for that, we have a calcium supplement here. This is without vitamin D3. Vitamin D3 is important mostly to animals that are active during the day, and even then they usually have their UVB radiation to help them produce it themselves. But crested geckos are nocturnal. You don't want to give them too much vitamin D3 if it's not needed. For this instance, we won't be having a vitamin D3 calcium. We just have this calcium here, calcium plus, which is fortified with other vitamins and minerals also. So when you combine this, the Repashy Calcium Plus, with the Crested Gecko diet, you get a pretty complete meal. It's very important though for baby cresteds and juvenile cresteds, if you want them to grow optimally, in my opinion, to feed them crickets, gut-loaded crickets. And that is probably a video I will also make sometime in the near future, showing you guys how to gut load insects, just to make sure your lizards are getting the most out of them. But anyways, I have a shaker cup here. This is actually a really big shaker cup because all these terrariums here have crested geckos in them. So I have a lot of geckos to feed. You could use any type of little container to mix your crested gecko diet in. You don't need to go with a big container like this. Crested gecko diet spoils quite quickly. Usually you're going to have it for 2 days max before you have to change it out. Even if it's kept in the fridge, you could actually freeze it though, but I find it to be a bit of a pain to freeze and then unfreeze. I just go with this big bag here. Obviously you don't have to get the 64-ounce bags. It's available, I believe, even in 3-ounce containers like the calcium. And then we have a little bowl to put our crested gecko diet in. It's very important that we realize that the gecko does not need to eat a lot. I find crested geckos, compared to most reptiles, actually eat not too much at all. Honestly, a cap like that of crested gecko diet will feed the gecko probably more than it actually is willing to eat for 2 days. So that's most of the essentials that we need, and you guys will notice that I didn't put a heat pad or a heat lamp here, and the reason being is that These guys require a temperature between 80 and 85 degrees Celsius, and honestly, I'd say the best is 82 degrees. I may have accidentally just said Celsius. Do not put it at 82 degrees Celsius. Your gecko will be cooked. No, 82 degrees Fahrenheit is what I meant to say. So they could actually tolerate much lower temperatures, but I find they do the best at about 82 degrees Fahrenheit, not Celsius. I don't have a thermometer here, but a thermometer would obviously be recommended, just to make sure that the temperatures are where they're supposed to be. I don't recommend a hygrometer, which is to measure humidity, just because for crested geckos, unless you live in like a place that is insanely dry, I find that just simply spraying them with this mister once a day is enough to hydrate them completely. And you guys will also notice that I didn't include a water bowl, and that's because it's very rare that they'll actually come down to the ground to drink from a water bowl. And I find that when I do put a water bowl, they don't eat as much crested gecko diet, because the crested gecko diet is going to be a liquid. So I kind of force them to eat the crested gecko diet in a way by not giving them a water bowl. And sometimes, to be honest with you, in the summer I'll only spray them once every second day, and the day that I actually don't spray, I'll put in the crested gecko diet, so that they'll hydrate themselves that way by eating the crested gecko diet. But really, the way they'll get most of their water in is when you spray. They'll lick the droplets off of the leaves, the sides of the cage, and also their eyeballs, which is kind of cool to see. So let's set up the cage now. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to rinse out our cage, make sure it's all nice and clean. I actually did a pretty good job at cleaning this, considering how dirty it was before. So anyways, we're going to wash out our cage, make sure there's no dust or anything like that. But don't use any like harsh cleaning products or anything like that, anything that'll leave a residue. Just water will be fine. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to prepare our plantation soil. Now, this typical brand here, it recommends that for 1 brick, which, by the way, 1 brick will be enough to fill this. You don't need more than 1 brick to fill the 12 by 12 by 18 tall exo-terra. But 1 brick will be put into a bucket like this, and then you will put 3 liters of warm water, and it'll make basically this dirt-like stuff here, which is actually coconut fiber. And when you're going to put it into the cage, you're going to want to squeeze the excess water out of it, right? You want it to be dry. Why you want it to be dry? Because when you're putting a crested gecko into a cage like this that's not drilled, which has no form of drainage whatsoever, you want to make sure there's not too much water sitting underneath your substrate, because that'll just sit at the bottom, become stagnant, and smell terrible and be a breeding ground for bacteria. So make sure you drain the water out of your earth, or coconut fiber I should say. So this is how our cage is looking thus far, and this is pretty much how it's going to stay. This is complete. Again, like I said, type of minimalist setup over here, a hide and a plant in the corner. Now, very, very important, realize where I put this plant, guys. In the corner at the back of the cage, and you'll find it is the common theme in all these cages. Now, why is it like that? Well, these geckos are arboreal, and they have specialized toe pads that allow them to stick to glass, right? Notice in these glass cages that if you're not careful and you put a plant or a hide, let's say, at the front of the cage, and the gecko is hiding in said plant, and when you open the cage, the gecko could either escape the cage, or even worse, he could leave his tail or his foot, even his head, hanging out of here, and then we close that, and there goes whichever limb was sticking out of the lizard. And unfortunately, I have heard and seen horror stories of people doing this by accident. By putting the hides and the plants in the back of the cage, this will never happen. And if the gecko just so happens to be out in the open, well, hopefully, you'll see it if nothing's there. So that's how we set up the cage. Now I'm going to show you guys how to feed the Crested Gecko. I actually won't show you guys how to feed crickets because honestly you could go back to my leopard gecko video and it's the same thing for basically all lizards. You know, you'll feed a Crested Gecko crickets up to max 3 times a week insects, and then one of those times you could dust with a calcium supplement. If your lizards are in fact breeding, make sure that calcium supplement does have vitamin D3 in it. Otherwise, the vitamin D3 is not really necessary. Alright, so my Repashy, meal replacement, and Calcium Plus is mixed together in this bottle. I'm going to pour it into the cap, and then that'll pretty much do it for the video, because we'll have fed the lizard, and I'm pretty sure I have given all the information, or all the essential information I should say. Now there's many ways of keeping all the different types of reptiles. There's no one perfect way. This is just a way that has really worked for me. As you guys could see, we breed them here, so I don't want to say I'm an expert or anything like that, but I do have 5 years of experience at breeding these guys and keeping these guys. And the methods I had showed you earlier in this video are what has worked for me. Now, one thing I want to say right away, you are by no means obligated to use Repashy to feed your Crested Geckos. It's just most people, this is what they're used to feeding, and for that reason I like to make sure all our geckos are eating Repashy, so that if anybody buys the animal, well, they could easily buy Repashy. Repashy is available pretty much everywhere, but if you should so choose, you could actually use a food processor and make your own Crested Gecko diet. There's lots of people who will mix mango with ground turkey and a vitamin D3 supplement, but Repashy is convenient just because it basically has everything they need already packed together. All you simply have to do is put 1 part Repashy to about 1.5 parts water. I know on the bag it says 2 parts water, but I have found that using a little bit less water, the geckos seem to like it better. So I'll basically show you guys the consistency it's supposed to be. Trusty shaker over here makes it really easy when feeding a bunch of lizards. So that's basically how it should look. It could actually be a little bit thicker than this, but no thicker than like an applesauce consistency. So that's how you make the Crested Gecko diet. That's how you keep Crested Geckos, at least the easiest way possible, I believe, on how to keep them. So hope you guys enjoyed this video. If I forgot anything, I will actually throw up a couple annotations on the video just to make sure this video is as complete as I could possibly make it. Crested geckos on the whole are very easy animals to take care of. They don't require too much of anything. The one thing though is that, let's say you're a family that goes on vacation quite often, you may want to invest into a misting system like what you see we have going over all these cages, because I'm not in here every single day, but we actually have a programmable mister, a Mist King it's actually called, that will spray these cages a couple times a day to keep the humidity where it needs to be. None of these cages are heated with any under tank heaters or anything like that, because they are in the room with our chameleons, which have these spot lamps on top of them, which raise the room's temperature right to where it's supposed to be. Again, can't say enough good things about Crested Geckos. They stay small. They require a cage that's only this big or this big, and they make for great pets, honestly. When they're young, they can be a little bit jumpy, but once you get past that, the more you handle them, they become quite friendly, really easy to handle. And this video could pretty much be applied to most of the geckos that come from New Caledonia that are widely available, such as the gargoyle gecko, the Chihuahua gecko. They're a little bit bigger though, so definitely go with the bigger size cage. Alright guys, I decided a nice way to end this video would be to show one of my favorite Crested geckos in our collection, this beautiful pinstripe cream female. Gonna let her have some Crested Gecko diet. And you could actually do this with your Cresteds as well, is let them eat off your finger every now and again. This just goes to show you guys that they actually do like the Repashy. I hear a lot of people saying that their geckos will not eat the Repashy, but I've never really had an issue at all with it. All our adults eat it really well. Most of our adults actually don't even want to touch crickets anymore, and they'll just basically eat this Crested gecko diet. And all our females, like I said, we don't give vitamin D3 too often. I believe there's a little bit of D3 in the Repashy. And we basically just feed Repashy, and well, of course when I say Repashy I mean the meal replacement and the calcium plus. We put that on our crickets and we mix it in our Repashy about twice a week for the females that are breeding, and honestly our females are all chunky and they look great. They produce some nice babies for us. So hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please like and subscribe, and take care.